Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today on History Bites, we're going to look at Chapter 21, Part 1, at Travelers Across Integrated Eurasia. Now, by the end of this History Bite, you feel answer the two following essential questions. How did changes in the political situation of Eurasia influence cultural exchange during this time? And how did travelers across Eurasia represent major historical trends for the time? Now, before we talk about some of these famous travelers, we should talk about the changes and conditions that made more extensive travel possible. One is that the nomadic empires did a good job at uniting Central Eurasia during this time period. These include the Turks, the Mongols, and the Timurids. And probably the best known example of this is the Mongol Empire's unification of most of the trade networks that made up the Silk Road. This also includes new technologies, as well as expanded trade routes, technologies in shipping such as Dhow ships or junk ships, as well as camel saddles on the trans-Saharan trade that made it easier to cross the Sahara Desert. We also see the increasing spread of cultures and diasporas, universal religions that made it easier to travel if you knew that there was a community of people who followed your same religion. Religions that had universal messages, so they were much easier to spread than religions that did not have universal messages. Also, diasporic communities, which made it easier to travel because you knew you'd find a community of like-minded individuals or people from where you were from, such as Persians, Arabs, Chinese, Malays, Turkic, and Norse people in different parts of the world. These changes and conditions made travel much easier and much more likely. Let's look at a few travelers. Let's talk about an English mystic named Margery Kempf. Now, in addition to being a Christian mystic, which means she had many divine experiences in which she claimed to see God and Jesus of Nazareth, she was also a businesswoman and was famous for an autobiography, the Book of Margery Kempf, which many historians think may have been the very first autobiography that we know of in recorded history in the English-speaking world. Now, Margery Kempf traveled quite a bit, and what's notable about her pilgrimages is that she oftentimes went to places that involved relics or the resting places of saints. She was a very religiously inspired woman, so much so that she was tried several times for heresy, allegedly not conforming to the views of the church. However, she was acquitted on all of those accounts. She visited places such as Jerusalem, post-Crusades, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, as well as a number of saints and relic sites in Eastern Europe and what is now Poland and Germany. Another individual who was influenced by the divine, and part of the reason for their travel, was the famous Sufi mystic from Central Asia, Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi. Now, as a child, he grew up in Central Asia, but he was forced to flee when the Mongols started to invade Central Asia. First, his family fled to Baghdad, where he met some early Sufis, as well as other Islamic intellectuals, and then he settled in what is now Anatolia, which at the time had been part of the Roman Empire, and Rumi, his name, actually means Roman in Arabic. And so this indicates where he grew up, but not where he was born. Now, Rumi is most known worldwide today for his poetry, and this should not come as a surprise. Rumi became a Sufi later in his life, and Sufis, in their quest for union with the divine, oftentimes used poetry as a means of seeking God or coming to know God. And what is most interesting is that Sufis often use these kind of poems and dances as a way to attract converts to their religion. And so it's no surprise that Rumi's poetry is often popular with Christians and Jews. And this was true during Rumi's life. At his funeral, many Christians and Jews attended. During his life, he traveled around what is now Anatolia and parts of the Middle East, reciting poetry and writing poetry, much of which can still be read today. I personally have a very special place for Rumi in my heart because I used some of his poetry during a speech I gave at my best friend's wedding. His family was Persian, and they were very much appreciative of this nod to one of the greatest poets of the Persian-speaking world. And so I am familiar with Rumi's poetry, and I like it very much. And if you are a poetry lover, I cannot stress enough maybe taking a look at some of his work. Let's talk about a businessman. And we've talked a little bit about Marco Polo already. He's the famous merchant from Venice who traveled to Yuan, China several times, where he met the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, and lived in China for 17 years, becoming a very efficient merchant, being fluent in several languages. Now, Marco Polo claims in his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, that he was employed by the great Khan, Kublai Khan, as an administrator of a region. Now, this is only supported by Marco Polo's point of view. We don't have any corresponding Chinese sources that attest to this. But it's not unusual for Mongols to use foreign administrators, as we talked about in chapter 17. So it is entirely possible that what he said was true. But what is more influential is that the Travels of Marco Polo, which is the book that he had dictated, he didn't write it, but he dictated it, influenced future European exploration. For example, Columbus, when he sailed to the New World, had a copy of the Travels of Marco Polo. He'd also read it before he proposed his journey, his sea route to India to the king and queen of Spain at the time. Let's talk about a diplomat. Probably the most famous one would be Ibn Battuta, who was a trained Muslim religious lawyer from North Africa, what is today Tunis. And Ibn Battuta is famous for traveling almost the entire Islamic world in his lifetime. Some historians think he might have even been the most traveled man prior to the invention of the steam engine that we know about. And we know this mainly because he left a journal, a diary, a sort of travel log. It was very, very extensive. And you can read the whole thing if you'd like to hear about his adventures. But the thing to note about Ibn Battuta is that when he traveled, he was always in the Islamic world. And as a trained Islamic lawyer in the Sharia, which is the Islamic law, his skills were always in demand. He always had a job, no matter where he went, whether it was northern South Asia in the Delhi Sultanate or in West Africa in Mali. He could always find a job because the rapid expansion of Islam meant that there was always a demand for those who were familiar with Islamic law. There's also Rabban Sauma, who is a diplomat for one of the later Mongol dynasties called the Ilkhanate that ruled over what is now Iran and parts of the Middle East. Now, the thing about Rabban Sauma is that he's actually Turkic, but he's Nestorian Christian, which is a special group of Christians that lived along the Silk Road. And he grew up in the Yuan dynasty in China. And he was actually on his way to Jerusalem for a Christian pilgrimage when he stopped in at the Ilkhanate and picked up a job from the then ruler of the Ilkhanate. And he was trying to get support from Europe so that the Ilkhanate could wage a war against the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. So the Mongol rulers of Persia sent Rabban Sauma to Europe to get support for a European crusade against Egypt. And Rabban Sauma was a very effective diplomat, in part because he was Christian and these Europeans were Christian. And so he had a little bit of an in with them already. His diplomatic efforts were actually not that successful. He didn't manage to get anybody to join the Sultan's, the Khan's crusade against the Mamluk Sultanate, and they were defeated. But his diplomacy indicates the widespread of the Turkic empires, as well as just the dominance in the Middle East at the time of these nomadic groups, because the Mamluk Sultanate, they themselves were nomadic Turkic soldiers, just like the Mongols, except they were Turkic, not Mongol, but they rode horses, and they had established a state in Egypt where they ruled over the population, former slave soldiers who had taken over the actual administration of the state. So, thank you for joining me in this History Bite. You should be able to answer those two essential questions from the beginning, and I will see you next time.